The Carter estate stood as a quiet monument to wealth and routine, tucked behind wrought-iron gates and rows of perfectly trimmed boxwood hedges. Inside, the marble floors gleamed under dimmed chandeliers, and the scent of polished wood lingered in every corridor. William Carter, a man in his late 60s, moved through this silence like a ghost tethered to ritual. Once a formidable figure in business, he had retreated from the world after his wife's passing, opting instead for the stillness of solitude. The house, though grand, had become more mausoleum than home, with each room maintained in flawless precision by a staff trained to never speak unless spoken to. Meals arrived on time, the fireplace was set each evening, and fresh flowers were replaced like clockwork, but nothing truly lived in that space anymore. William's staff functioned like shadows present, but never acknowledged. Among them was Emily, a soft-spoken young maid in her mid-20s who had worked for the Carter household for nearly 3 years. With her hair always pulled tightly back and her uniform slightly oversized, she blended so well into the backdrop of the estate that William rarely thought of her beyond the tasks she performed. To him, she was a part of the machinery, dependable and silent, much like the grandfather clock in the foyer or the central heating system that kept the house warm without a sound. He did not know where she came from, nor did he ask. Her presence, like everything else in the mansion, was designed not to interrupt the quiet he had so carefully constructed around himself that all changed on a rainy Tuesday night, sometime around 2:20 a.m., when William stirred from sleep, parched and restless. He padded down the wide staircase in his slippers, wearing the same robe he had owned for over a decade. The house was dark except for a thin ribbon of light glowing under the kitchen door. Curious and mildly annoyed, since the staff was expected to be off duty by 10, he approached expecting to find a light left on or a forgotten appliance humming in the background. But when he pushed the door open, what he saw stopped him cold. Emily was seated at the kitchen island, surrounded by open textbooks and loose papers, a steaming cup of tea at her side. Her hair was loosened from its usual tight bun, and she wore a grey cardigan over her uniform, the sleeves pushed to her elbows. She hadn't noticed him. Her head was bent low, lips moving silently as she reviewed a page of handwritten notes. A worn spiral notebook lay open in front of her, pages filled with dense handwriting and colourful diagrams of human anatomy. William stood motionless in the doorway, reluctant to break the fragile scene before him. For a moment he thought perhaps he was dreaming. The soft scratch of her pencil against paper, the quiet intensity of her gaze. It all seemed too surreal to be happening in his otherwise sterile kitchen, but then she glanced up and saw him. Her eyes widened in alarm, and she stood so quickly that her stool scraped loudly against the tiled floor. I'm sorry, Mr. Carter," she stammered. "I didn't mean I thought no one would be—" He raised a hand gently, his voice even. "It's all right," he said. "I just came for water." She nodded quickly, already gathering her things in a panic, but he stopped her again. "There's no need to leave." He walked slowly to the counter, filled a glass from the dispenser, and looked down at the open book. "What are you working on?" Emily hesitated, her fingers still trembling slightly as she clutched the edge of her notebook. "An entrance exam," she said, her voice soft but clear. For an online pre-med program, William blinked. Of all the things he expected to hear in his kitchen that night, this wasn't even in the realm of possibility. "I study after work," she added almost apologetically. "I can't afford traditional school, but if I pass this, I might get a scholarship." He looked again at the materials on the counter. Textbooks, clearly. Second-hand pages curled at the corners, some tape to hold them together. Notes in the margins, diagrams hand-drawn in colored ink, a page on renal function carefully shaded. "You want to be a nurse?" he asked. Emily shook her head slowly, her eyes meeting his for the first time, with something burning behind them, not defiance but purpose. "A doctor," she replied, steady now. There was a pause, long and unfamiliar, as William absorbed the weight of her answer. He nodded. Once set down his water glass and said nothing more. "Don't let me disturb you," he murmured before leaving the kitchen. But in truth, something in him had already been deeply disturbed, something he had long buried beneath marble and silence now flickering to life under the glow of a single kitchen lamp. The night he found Emily in the kitchen did not fade from William Carter's memory the way most moments did. Instead, it settled into his thoughts like a stone dropped into a still lake, creating ripples that reached into every quiet hour that followed. For the first time in years, he found himself thinking about another person, not in passing, not in function, but in depth. He noticed things he hadn't. Before, the way Emily moved with purpose through the halls, her careful attention to detail the worn soles of her shoes. He realized that until that night, he hadn't really seen her. She had been a fixture in the house like the antique vase in the study, or the paintings on the wall present but unnamed. But now every glimpse of her brought with it questions. What drove her? How long had she been studying in silence, burning midnight oil while the rest of the house slept? Curiosity slowly evolved into quiet investigation. William, a man once known for his precision and strategy in boardrooms, began applying those same instincts to understanding Emily's world. He asked no questions directly, but discreetly reviewed the housekeeping schedule, checked the kitchen logs, and even observed her routine through the subtle network of cameras installed in the house for security. What he saw humbled him. Emily rose before dawn, worked tirelessly throughout the day, and studied deep into the night, all without ever complaining, asking for favors or seeking recognition. He noticed how she borrowed books from the local library and scribbled notes in recycled notebooks, and how she sometimes skipped lunch, likely saving money to send back to her family. She didn't just dream of becoming a doctor, she was fighting for it with everything she had. One afternoon, he opened his laptop and searched for the name printed on one of her textbooks, an online pre-med program affiliated with a state university. It took only a few clicks to learn more, and the reality both impressed and unsettled him. The program was rigorous, competitive, and designed for non-traditional students with limited access to traditional education. Tuition wasn't exorbitant by elite standards, but for someone like Emily, earning minimum wage and helping support younger siblings, it was a mountain. Students were expected to afford lab kits, testing fees, proctored exams, and the rare but required weekend intensives on campus. There were stories on student forums of applicants working 3 jobs just to cover basic tuition. William stared at the screen, suddenly aware of how distant his wealth had made him from such struggles. He thought of the fortune sitting unused in accounts of the trust funds, the properties, the foundations set up in his name for tax purposes, and how little any of it had meant to him lately. And then a name came to him. Grace. His late wife had been a teacher, a believer in second chances and the transformative power of education. She had once told him in a moment, long forgotten, "There's no greater legacy than helping someone rise beyond their circumstances." That memory struck him now with a force that took his breath away. He opened a folder marked Carter Family Trust and drafted a new initiative, one that would operate discreetly under the name the Grace Initiative. Through this, he set up a full scholarship for Emily, covering all current and future tuition fees, textbooks, technology, and living expenses. He included a modest monthly stipend for personal use and ensured all communications would go through a third-party advisor to maintain anonymity. It was, he decided, not a handout, but an investment in someone who had already proven herself 10 times over. A few weeks later, Emily received an email from the university's financial office informing her that an anonymous donor had fully funded her education. She read the message 3 times, her eyes welling with disbelief. In the privacy of her room, she cried not out of weakness, but out of the sheer weight of relief. The sleepless nights, the fear of failure, the growing debt, all of it momentarily dissolved. She didn't know who had done it. She didn't ask. Instead, she simply whispered a quiet thank you into the night, as if the universe had heard her prayers after all. William, of course, said nothing. He merely watched from the quiet corners of his estate, carrying on as if nothing had changed, but something had, and not just for Emily. In the days that followed, a strange lightness returned to William's steps. He spent more time by the windows watching the seasons shift in the garden Grace had once loved. He even found himself humming quietly when passing by the kitchen, now imagining it not as a place of service, but as the birthplace of someone's future. Though Emily remained unaware of his role, William didn't mind. For the first time in years, he felt something close to purpose again, not in business, not in legacy, but in the quiet act of lifting someone else higher. It was in many ways a return to the man he used to be, the one Grace had loved, the one who believed in people and possibilities. And though he never said a word, his heart knew. Helping Emily had helped him too. The acceptance email came late on a rainy Thursday evening. Emily sat alone at the kitchen table with a chipped mug of tea in one hand and her phone in the other, her thumb hovering above the screen. When she finally opened it, she had to read the message twice to let the words sink in. "Congratulations, Emily. You've been accepted into the fall pre-med cohort." The rest of the words blurred behind the tears forming in her eyes. After months of studying in silence, of second-guessing her dreams, of sacrificing sleep and sanity, this was the moment she had hoped for. But joy was not the only emotion that came rushing in. Behind the elation was a deep, aching weight: her family. Her younger brother had just started high school, and her mother's health was fragile. Her paycheck, though modest, was the only stable income keeping the household afloat. The dream was real, but so was the duty. For the next few days, Emily moved through the estate like a ghost. Her chores were done as always, perfectly, without complaint, but William noticed the light in her eyes had dimmed. She no longer studied at night. She didn't linger in the kitchen with her books. It was as if the flame that had burned so brightly had been smothered by something heavier than doubt. William, puzzled and concerned, decided to invite her to sit with him on the veranda one afternoon, a rare request, but one Emily could not refuse. As they sat in the quiet shade beneath the sprawling oaks, he asked softly, "You stopped reading?" She hesitated, the letter still folded neatly in her apron pocket. "I got in," she said, barely above a whisper. "I got accepted." William smiled faintly, but the look on her face told him something was wrong. "But you're not going," he said. Reading between the lines, she looked down and nodded. Tears slipped from the corners of her eyes, but she quickly brushed them away. "I can't leave my family behind. They rely on me. My brother. My mom. We don't have much." William was silent for a long moment, then leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. His voice was low but resolute. "Emily, I was the donor," he said quietly. She turned to him in shock. "It was you." He nodded. "I saw what you were trying to do, and I couldn't ignore it. But more importantly, I need you to understand something. Surviving isn't the same as living. You're carrying your whole family on your shoulders, but if you give up your dream now, what will that teach them? That dreams only belong to the wealthy." His words hung in the air like a gentle rebuke, firm but kind. "You deserve more than survival." Emily was stunned, not just by the revelation, but by the sincerity in his voice. This was not the cold, reclusive man she had once assumed him to be. This was someone who had watched her struggle quietly, lifted her up, and now offered her a choice she had never believed she had the right to make. She looked at her hands, calloused from work, trembling now with emotion. "But what if I fail?" she whispered. William smiled gently. "Then you fail trying, but don't fail by staying where your spirit will wither." The truth of his words shook her. For so long she had confused endurance with strength, sacrifice with nobility. But maybe, just maybe, the bravest thing she could do for her family was to succeed fully, unapologetically, and on her own terms. That night, Emily sat alone once more at the kitchen table, but this time with her acceptance letter spread out in front of her. She wrote a list: rent, groceries, medication, her brother's school fees. Then beside each, she wrote what the scholarship would now cover. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to make the impossible feel possible. She thought of her mother's soft voice, always encouraging her to dream even when the cupboards were bare. She thought of her little brother, whose face lit up whenever she explained science to him. And she thought of William Carter, the man who had seen her when she felt invisible. When the sun began to rise, she folded the letter and placed it inside a notebook. She had made her decision. The next morning, with a mix of fear and hope braided tightly in her chest, Emily told William she would go. "It won't be easy," she admitted, "but I have to try." He nodded, his expression unreadable, but the way his shoulders relaxed told her everything. As she walked away, she felt a strange lightness in her step, an unfamiliar sense of release. She wasn't abandoning her family, she was honoring them with courage, and though the path ahead was uncertain for the first time in her life, she wasn't walking it alone. Somewhere behind her, an old man sat on a veranda watching a seed he had planted begin to bloom. The halls of the university hospital were a far cry from the quiet estate kitchen where Emily once pored over borrowed textbooks by candlelight. Now, surrounded by the hum of gurneys, the shuffle of doctors' shoes, and the low murmur of medical discussions, she was no longer a maid with a dream. She was a first-year med student navigating one of the most rigorous academic environments imaginable. The pace was relentless, and the expectations unforgiving. Many students came from legacies of medicine, from families steeped in privilege and preparation. Emily had none of that. What she did have, however, was grit. She arrived early, stayed late, took notes feverishly, and volunteered for every opportunity to shadow or assist her professors, soon took notice. Not because she was the loudest or the brightest, but because she was the most relentless in her commitment to learn and to serve. Despite her academic responsibilities, Emily never let go of the one tradition that grounded her writing letters to Mr. Carter. She didn't sign them, nor did she send them through traditional means. Each week, she folded her words with care, slipped them into a stamped envelope, and dropped them into a P.O. box linked to the Grace Initiative. Her letters spoke of endless nights studying the circulatory system, the anxiety of her first anatomy practical, and the rush of holding a patient's hand during a difficult diagnosis. But beyond the technical details, Emily poured her soul into those pages. She wrote about her doubts about missing her family, about the internal pressure to prove she deserved every inch of this opportunity. And always she ended with gratitude, not just for the scholarship, but for the silent encouragement that had followed her like a steady flame. Back at the estate, William Carter would retreat to his study every Friday evening, a tumbler of scotch in hand, and quietly read her letters. He never replied, not directly, but the words filled the empty corners of his once lonely mansion with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Emily's journey reminded him of something his late wife used to say: "Legacy isn't about what you leave behind, it's about what you lift while you're still here." And for the first time since her passing, those words began to mean something again. Inspired by Emily's tenacity and courage, William began researching small grassroots organizations, local health clinics, and community college scholarship programs. Without fanfare or press releases, he began making anonymous donations, often under the name of the Grace Initiative. It was never about recognition, it was about ripples. Meanwhile, Emily's world expanded. She made friends, real ones, who respected her, not just for her academic capabilities, but for her empathy and the unique lens through which she viewed the human condition. She was the one classmates turned to when they doubted themselves, the one patients remembered, because she listened longer than anyone else. She wasn't just becoming a doctor, she was becoming a healer. And yet, she never let the new world swallow the girl who had once swept marble floors and rationed dinner to stretch a paycheck. That girl lived in her bones and reminded her to stay humble, to keep climbing, and to never forget who she was doing this for. There were moments of collapse. Of course, nights when the exhaustion made her question everything. Days when a bad grade or a misdiagnosis shook her confidence to the core. But in those moments, Emily would reread her own letters, the ones she sent to William, and remember her purpose. They were like anchors, silent promises to herself and to a man who had seen value in her before she had the courage to see it in herself. She didn't know if he still read them. She didn't need to know. What mattered was that writing to him had become a mirror, a space where she could process, reflect, and keep moving forward. In time, William's life changed in parallel. The once quiet mansion now hosted planning meetings for new charitable initiatives. Rooms that once gathered dust now stored medical supplies headed for underserved clinics. And though William remained reclusive in the public eye, those closest to him noticed a gentler man. A man who no longer measured his worth by net worth, but by names of students like Emily, whose lives had taken flight because someone chose to believe quietly, generously, and without condition. Emily didn't just remind him of who his wife was. She reminded him of who he still had the capacity to be. Through her effort, he found his purpose again. And through her purpose, she began to transform not only her own life, but the legacy of a man she still only knew as her silent benefactor. Years had passed since Emily first stepped into medical school with trembling hands and a heart full of dreams. Now those dreams stood solid in brick and mortar at the corner of 104th Street in Queens, the Haven Clinic. A modest, sunlit building with welcoming green doors was her life's work. It served the people she once stood beside, people who worked 2 jobs, skipped prescriptions to buy food, or waited months for basic care. The clinic wasn't flashy. There were no high-tech marvels or grand marble lobbies. Instead, there were warm waiting rooms, bilingual nurses, and evening hours for parents who couldn't afford to miss work. Emily, now Dr. Emily Carter, wore her white coat with grace walking the halls each day, not as a boss, but as a neighbor, someone who had once sat in those same chairs. While the Haven Clinic bore Emily's vision, its heartbeat was still quietly sustained by William Carter's generosity. Now, in his late 70s, William no longer managed sprawling business ventures or attended board meetings. His wealth moved silently through his foundation, the Grace Initiative supporting scholarships, community health centers, and young people with impossible dreams. But among all the lives his generosity touched, none held quite the same place as Emily. He watched her rise not from a distance of indifference, but with quiet pride. And though he never asked for updates, never requested public credit, the clinic's quarterly reports were always mailed to his estate, where he read them alone, often more than once. One chilly afternoon in autumn, William made the trip to Queens for the first time, dressed in a simple coat hat pulled low. He sat on a bench outside the Haven Clinic, just watching. He didn't go in, he didn't want applause or recognition. But as fate would have it, Emily stepped outside between appointments for a breath of fresh air. She paused when she saw him. Neither spoke at first. No dramatic gasps, no declarations, just 2 people once bound by quiet nights and unspoken dreams, now sharing a silent reunion in the middle of a bustling city. She sat beside him, and for a long while they simply looked at the place they'd built together. Without either saying it aloud, both knew that this was the legacy they had written, not with signatures or press releases, but with intention, sacrifice, and belief. Emily finally turned to him and said, "It's more than I imagined. Not the building, but the people. The kids who stop coughing. The mums who finally get checkups. The dads who walk out with hope." William nodded, his eyes misty. "You were always meant to do this," he replied. Voice soft. "I just cleared the path. You did the walking, that was all. No grand ceremony followed. No photos were taken. But in that moment, something rare passed between them, a kind of peace that comes only when a journey reaches its truest destination." She took his hand briefly, a gesture that said, "Thank you and goodbye," all at once. In the years that followed, the Haven Clinic grew not in size but in influence. It became a model for what healthcare could look like when dignity came first. Medical students volunteered there. Community leaders held town halls there, and always at the heart of it was Emily, teaching, treating, and listening. Her story began to spread, not because she sought fame, but because people needed hope. Journalists wrote about the doctor who once cleaned floors. Young girls in Queens whispered her name like a promise. Parents told their children that perseverance could look like a white coat, earned one midnight at a time. And in every story told, there was a quiet acknowledgement of the man who saw her first, not as a maid, but as a future healer. William passed away quietly in his sleep one winter with a letter from Emily tucked in the drawer beside his bed. At his request, there was no funeral. only a simple plaque installed outside the Haven Clinic that read, "To grace and to all who walk unseen but dream with fire." Emily never stopped working. But once a year, on the anniversary of their meeting, she sat on the same bench where they had once reunited. She didn't speak. She didn't need to, because everything they had hoped for, everything they had believed in, now stood behind her. Laughing children, healthy families, second chances. And in that quiet corner of Queens, their legacy lived on. If stories like this one touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Deep Inside HQ, where real emotions meet powerful storytelling. Each story we share is crafted to remind you that kindness, courage, and second chances still exist in the most unexpected places. Hit the like button. If this story moved, you share it with someone who believes in the power of dreams, and comment below with your thoughts. We love hearing your voice. Let's continue spreading hope, one story at a time.